Vietnam was a war of noise. It was the deafening roar of phantom jets dropping napalm. It was the rhythmic thumping of Huey rotors. It was the chaotic chatter of M60 machine guns tearing through the bamboo. But underneath the cacophony, there was a silent war. A war fought not by battalions, but by lone individuals. A war where success wasn't measured in ground taken, but in specific targets removed. This is the story of the snipers of Vietnam, the men who turned the jungle into a hunting ground. To understand the sniper in Vietnam, you have to understand the frustration of the American war machine in 1965. The United States Marines landed with massive firepower. They were ready for World War II-style battles. They wanted lines. They wanted fronts. They wanted an enemy they could see. But the Viet Cong, VC, and the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, refused to play by those rules. They were ghosts. They would strike from the tree line and vanish. They would set booby traps and disappear into tunnels. They would harass a patrol with a single rifle shot from 500 yards away, wounding a Marine, slowing down the entire company, and destroying morale. The Marines realized they didn't just need more bombs. They needed a scalpel. They needed men who could out-guerrilla the guerrilla. Men who could lie in the mud for 3 days without moving, waiting for one specific moment. The problem was, the US military had largely forgotten the art of sniping after the Korean War. There were no schools. There were no official manuals. It started as an experiment. Captain Jim Land, a competitive shooter and a visionary, began scraping together a ragtag group of marksmen in the 1st Marine Division. He didn't have official equipment. He didn't have a budget. He raided the special services lockers, the places where they kept sports equipment, and pulled out target rifles, the Winchester Model 70. This wasn't a military weapon. It was a hunting rifle, a bolt-action wooden-stock beauty designed for shooting deer in the American Midwest, not for hunting men in the humid rot of the jungle. But it was accurate. Dead accurate. They mounted inertial scopes on them, long, heavy telescopic sights that looked like telescopes from the 19th century. They were fragile. They fogged up in the rain. If you bumped them against a tree, they lost their zero. But in the hands of a master, that combination was lethal out to 1,000 yards. The training was brutal, but not in the physical sense of running miles. It was mental torture. A sniper had to learn the art of the stalk. Imagine crawling across a field of razor-sharp elephant grass for 500 yards. But you can't just crawl. You have to move so slowly that the eye cannot detect motion. You move an inch. You stop. You wait for the wind to blow the grass. And then you move another inch. You have to ignore the ants biting your neck. You have to ignore the sun baking your back until your skin blisters. You have to ignore the cramps in your legs. If a bird flies away, suddenly you have failed. If a blade of grass moves against the wind, you have failed. Because in the field, failure doesn't mean a bad grade. It means a bullet in the head. The VC were excellent trackers. They knew the jungle. If they saw a footprint, a broken twig, or a flattened patch of grass, they would mortar the area. So the sniper became a ghost. He learned to veg up, tying live vegetation to his burlap suit. He learned to smell like the jungle. He stopped using soap. He stopped smoking. He ate raw garlic to mask his scent. He became an animal. The first missions were defensive. They were sent out to protect the perimeters of the fire bases. The NVA snipers had been wreaking havoc on the Marines. They would sit in the tree lines and pick off the guys filling sandbags or standing guard. It was terrifying. You couldn't see the muzzle flash in the bright sun. You just heard the crack of the bullet passing you, followed by the thump of the report. The American snipers were sent out to hunt these hunters. This was the most dangerous game on Earth. Counter-sniping. You are looking for a man who is looking for you. You sit in a hide, looking through your scope for hours. Your eye starts to burn. Your muscles lock up. You are looking for a target indicator. A glint of sunlight off a lens. The unnatural straight line of a rifle barrel in a world of curved vines. A flock of birds startled from a tree. And when you see him, the physics come into play. Shooting a rifle in Vietnam was a mathematical nightmare. The heat was so intense it created mirage, shimmering waves of heat rising from the ground that distorted the image in the scope. The target would look like it was dancing. The humidity was so thick it actually affected the flight of the bullet. Heavy air slows the projectile down. You had to calculate the range, calculate the windage, calculate the temperature, calculate the humidity. And you had to do it all in seconds, while your heart was pounding against your ribs like a sledgehammer. Breath control. Inhale, exhale, pause. In that respiratory pause, when the body is perfectly still, you squeeze the trigger. Not pull, squeeze. Like you were trying to press a drop of water from the tip of your finger. Crack. The Winchester kicks into your shoulder. You don't blink. You watch the trace, the disturbance in the air caused by the bullet, as it arcs towards the target. And then, the pink mist. One shot, one kill. The psychological impact on the enemy was immediate. Suddenly, the jungle wasn't safe for them either. They realized that the Americans had brought a new kind of demon to the battlefield, a demon that could reach out and touch them from half a mile away. But being a sniper was a lonely existence. The regular grunts, the infantrymen, didn't trust them. They thought snipers were weird, cold-blooded. A grunt fights with his brothers, screaming and shooting together. A sniper fights alone or with one spotter. He kills unsuspecting men who are eating rice, or writing letters, or cleaning their weapons. It seemed like murder to some. But to the sniper, it was the ultimate act of protection. Every Viet Cong officer he killed meant one less ambush planned. Every NVA machine gunner he dropped meant a whole squad of Marines might survive the next patrol. They were the guardian angels of the battlefield, but their wings were made of burlap, and their halos were the crosshairs of a scope. Among these early pioneers, one man stood out. A big man from Arkansas who wore a white feather in his boonie hat. A man who would become the most feared sniper in the history of warfare. His name was Carlos Hathcock, and when he arrived in Vietnam, the war changed. He didn't just hunt the enemy, he taunted them. He went where no one else dared to go. But before we get to the legend of White Feather, we have to understand the environment that forged him. The Elephant Valley, Hill 55, the places where the mud was red, and the death was sudden. Hill 55, it wasn't much to look at, just a muddy bump south of Da Nang. But in 1966, it was the hunting ground of a ghost. His name was Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock, but the Viet Cong didn't call him that. They called him Long Trang, White Feather. He was a giant of a man, a country boy from Arkansas who moved through the jungle with the grace of a panther. And he did something that no sniper should ever do. He advertised his presence. He stuck a small white gull feather into the band of his bush hat. It was a taunt, a challenge. He was telling the enemy, I am here. Come and get me. The North Vietnamese army put a bounty on his head. $30,000. The highest bounty of the war. Usually, a sniper's life was worth $8. Every NVA marksman wanted to be the one to kill White Feather. They hunted him, but he hunted them back. The duel that defined his career, and perhaps the history of sniping, happened in the sweltering heat of the Elephant Valley. Intelligence reported that a top NVA counter-sniper, a man known simply as the Cobra, had been sent down with one specific mission: kill Hathcock. The Cobra was good. He had already killed a Marine by shooting him through a canteen while he was drinking. Hathcock and his spotter, John Burke, went out to find him. It was a game of chess played with rifles. They moved slowly, meticulously, across a ridgeline. The heat was suffocating, 100 degrees. The humidity was so thick you could chew the air. They waited. They watched. For hours, nothing happened. Just the buzz of cicadas and the heat shimmering off the rocks. Then, a mistake. Hathcock saw a flash. It wasn't a muzzle flash. It was a glint, a tiny sparkle of sunlight reflecting off a piece of glass deep in the brush, 500 yards away. A sniper knows that glint. It means only one thing: a lens. And if you can see the lens, it means the lens is looking at you. Hathcock didn't think. He didn't calculate. He reacted on pure instinct. He swung his Winchester Model 70, settled the crosshairs on that tiny sparkle, and squeezed the trigger. crack. The bullet flew true. Hathcock and Burke moved forward cautiously, expecting a trap. But there was no return fire. When they reached the enemy position, they found the Cobra dead. He was lying on his back, his rifle across his chest. Hathcock leaned down to inspect the body. What he saw made his blood run cold. The American bullet had gone straight through the center of the NVA sniper's scope. It had shattered the glass, traveled down the metal tube of the scope, and entered the sniper's eye, killing him instantly. Hathcock stood up, shaken. He realized the physics of that shot. For a bullet to pass straight through a scope like that, both rifles had to be perfectly aligned. The Cobra had been aiming directly at Hathcock's face. His finger was probably on the trigger. Hathcock had fired maybe a fraction of a second sooner. It was the difference between life and death, measured in milliseconds. But the mission that broke the human limits of endurance wasn't a duel. It was a crawl. Hathcock volunteered for a suicide mission. The target, a North Vietnamese general. The location was deep in enemy territory, surrounded by 3 layers of security. Hathcock decided to go alone. He didn't want to risk a spotter's life. He was dropped off by a helicopter miles away from the target area. He entered the tree line and dropped to his belly. And he didn't stand up again for 3 days and 3 nights. He became a worm. He moved inch by inch, literally. He would push himself forward with his toes, slide his rifle a few inches, and stop. He didn't crawl on his hands and knees. He slithered, keeping his body flat against the mud to avoid being seen. He moved across a massive open field of elephant grass. The sun beat down on him, blistering his skin. He had no food. He had very little water. He urinated in his pants because moving to relieve himself would give away his position. The smell attracted bugs. Ants covered him. Biting flies swarmed his face. He didn't swat them. He didn't twitch. He let them bite. At one point, a bamboo viper, a snake whose venom creates agony before death, slithered over his hand. Hathcock stared at the snake. The snake stared at him. If he flinched, the snake would bite. If he jumped, the NVA guards patrolling 20 yards away would see him. So he froze. He became a statue. The snake eventually lost interest and moved on. On the second day, an NVA patrol walked by. They were looking for him. They knew an American was in the area. Hathcock lay in the grass, camouflaged perfectly. One of the enemy soldiers stepped on Hathcock's hand. Imagine the discipline. A boot crushing your fingers into the dirt. The pain shooting up your arm. Hathcock didn't scream. He didn't pull his hand away. He lay there, essentially dead, until the soldier walked on. By the morning of the 3rd day, he was delirious. He was hallucinating from dehydration and exhaustion. But he was in position. He was 700 yards from the general's compound. He waited. Finally, the target emerged. The general walked out onto a small porch, surrounded by aides. He looked relaxed. He thought he was safe. Hathcock cleared his mind. He pushed away the pain, the hunger, the fear. He became the rifle. He calculated the wind. He settled the crosshairs on the general's chest. Squeeze. The shot rang out. The general crumpled. Hathcock didn't wait to see the panic. He was already moving, but this time he had to run. The entire NVA army seemed to wake up. They chased him through the jungle. He ran for miles, dodging patrols, fighting his way to the extraction point. When the helicopter finally picked him up, he couldn't stand. They had to drag him on board. He had crawled over 1,000 yards on his stomach. He had killed a general, and he had survived. Carlos Hathcock wasn't just a sniper. He was a force of nature. But the war eventually takes a toll on everyone, even a legend. And for Hathcock, the end wouldn't come from a bullet, but from fire. While Carlos Hathcock was becoming a legend in the north, another predator was quietly stalking the rice paddies of the Arizona Territory, south of Da Nang. His name was Chuck Mawhinney. He was a kid from Oregon, 19 years old. Soft-spoken, humble, the kind of guy you'd pass in a grocery store without a second glance. But behind a rifle, he was a prodigy. Hathcock hunted like a cat. Mawhinney hunted like a wolf. He was aggressive. He didn't just wait for targets. He went out and kicked the bushes until they ran. His weapon of choice was the M40, a militarized version of the Remington 700. It was a beautiful bolt-action instrument of death. But Mawhinney knew that in Vietnam, the war didn't stop when the sun went down. In fact, that's when it got dangerous. The NVA owned the night. They moved their supplies, their troops, and their rockets under the cloak of darkness, believing they were invisible. But they were wrong. Because we had brought a new kind of magic to the jungle, the Starlight Scope, the PVS-2. It was huge, heavy, and ugly. It sat on top of the rifle like an oversized telescope. It hummed when you turned it on. It sucked batteries dry in a few hours. But when you looked through it, the pitch-black jungle turned into a ghostly grain-green world. It amplified the starlight and moonlight thousands of times. For the first time in history, we could see them in the dark. The mission that would define Mawhinney's career and terrify the NVA High Command happened on a humid night in 1969. Mawhinney and his spotter were inserted near a river crossing in the Elephant Valley. It was a known infiltration route. Intelligence said the NVA were moving a large force through the area. The two Marines dug in. They were alone. No infantry support. No radio backup that could get there in time. Just two men in the mud. Mawhinney made a choice that night. He left his bolt-action M40 aside. Instead, he picked up an M14. The M14 was a semi-automatic battle rifle. It fired the same heavy 7.62 millimeter round, but you didn't have to work a bolt between shots. You just pulled the trigger. He mounted a Starlight Scope on it. They waited. The rain drizzled on and off. The insects buzzed. The river flowed quietly, masking the sound of their breathing. Hours passed. The boredom was excruciating. The heavy Starlight Scope strained his neck. The green glow burned his retina. Then, a splash. Mawhinney tensed. He looked through the scope. At first, it was just a blur. Then, the green shapes resolved into human figures. One NVA soldier stepped into the river. Then another. Then another. They kept coming. It wasn't a patrol. It was a platoon. Maybe two. 20, 30, 40 men, wading chest deep into the water, holding their rifles above their heads to keep them dry. They were less than 75 yards away. Mawhinney's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at his spotter. They both realized the situation. They were outnumbered 50-1. If the NVA reached the bank, the two Marines would be overrun and hacked to pieces in seconds. Mawhinney knew he couldn't snipe them one by one. The bolt action would be too slow. The panic would scatter them. He needed violence of action. He needed to be a machine gunner with a sniper's accuracy. He waited until the lead element was in the middle of the river, completely exposed, fighting the current. He settled the glowing green crosshair on the chest of the point man. He took a breath. Blam! The M14 kicked. The point man disappeared under the water. But Mawhinney didn't wait to watch him fall. He shifted targets instantly. Blam! 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 He worked the rifle like a piston. He didn't fire wildly. Every shot was aimed. Every shot was a kill. He shot the men in the rear to block the retreat. He shot the men in the front to stall the advance. Chaos erupted in the river. The NVA were screaming, splashing, firing blindly into the dark jungle. They couldn't see the muzzle flash because of the Starlight Scope's flash suppressor. They didn't know where the death was coming from. They only knew that men were dying every time they tried to move. Mawhinney fired 16 rounds in 30 seconds. 16 shots. 16 distinct recoils. Then, silence. The splashing stopped. The screaming faded into gurgles. The rest of the NVA platoon, terrified by the invisible demon that had just decimated their lead squad, broke and ran back into the jungle. Mawhinney and his spotter didn't stick around to count bodies. They knew the mortars would be coming next. They packed up and vanished into the night, slipping away before the enemy could regroup. The next morning, a patrol went out to check the river. They found the bodies. They found the blood trailing downstream. Chuck Mawhinney had stopped an entire enemy advance, single-handedly, in half a minute. He wasn't awarded a medal for it at the time. It was just another night at the office. It wasn't until decades later that the world learned about the quiet boy from Oregon who became the deadliest shot in the Marine Corps. But Mawhinney didn't care about the numbers. He didn't count kills to brag. He counted them because every NVA soldier he stopped in that river was one less soldier who could attack his friends at the firebase. It was the ultimate hunting trip, he once said. A man hunting another man who has a gun. But the hunt takes a toll. You can wash the mud off your boots, but you can't wash the green ghostly images of dying men out of your mind. The starlight scope let us see the night, but it also burned the horror of war into our memories forever. War is hell. But sometimes, hell has a specific face. For the Marines operating around Hill 55 in 1966, that face belonged to a woman. Intelligence called her the Apache. She wasn't a typical sniper. She didn't just want to kill Marines, she wanted to break them. She led a platoon of Viet Cong snipers who operated in the heavy brush surrounding the base. Her tactic was pure psychological terror. She would capture a young Marine during a patrol, but she wouldn't execute him, not immediately. She would drag him to a spot just outside the perimeter wire, close enough for his friends to hear, but far enough away that they couldn't rescue him without walking into an ambush. And then, she would go to work. She would torture him. Slowly, she would skin him alive. She would cut off eyelids and fingernails. She would make him scream. For hours, the Marines in the bunkers had to listen to their brothers screaming in the darkness. They gripped their rifles until their knuckles turned white. They begged permission to go out and save him, or at least to go out and die trying. But the commanders knew it was a trap. The Apache was waiting for a rescue team to slaughter. Just before dawn, the screaming would stop. A single gunshot would end it. The silence that followed was worse than the screams. It destroyed the morale of the unit. Men couldn't sleep. They were terrified of being captured. The Apache was winning the war without firing a shot in anger. Carlos Hathcock decided that this had to end. "She's mine," he told his spotter. "We're going to get her." This wasn't a military mission anymore. It was personal. It was an extermination. Hathcock and his spotter moved out into the Badlands. They knew the Apache's patterns. They knew she liked to operate near a specific ridgeline. For days, they hunted her. They found signs of her platoon, footprints, broken branches. On the third day, luck, or fate, intervened. Hathcock's spotter saw movement. A group of 5 Viet Cong were moving along a trail. In the lead was a small, squat woman carrying a customized rifle, the Apache. She was 700 yards away. Hathcock settled into his firing position. He checked the wind. He checked the range. But then something happened. The Apache stepped off the trail. She squatted down to urinate. It was a moment of vulnerability, a moment of humanity in a monster. Hathcock's spotter whispered, "Do it now." But Hathcock waited. He wasn't hesitating out of mercy. He was waiting for a clean shot. He wanted to make sure she never screamed again. But he also knew the rules of sniping. You shoot the leader, the rest might scatter. Or they might counterattack. While the Apache was squatting, the soldier behind her started walking toward her. He crossed in front of Hathcock's scope. Hathcock held his fire. If he shot the soldier, the Apache would dive for cover and disappear. He waited for the soldier to pass. The moment the soldier cleared the reticle, Hathcock squeezed the trigger. Crack! The Winchester bucked. The 73-grain bullet crossed the valley in less than a second. It hit the Apache square in the torso. She collapsed instantly. Hathcock didn't celebrate. He chambered another round and fired again, hitting her a second time to ensure she was dead. The rest of the VC squad panicked and ran. Hathcock and his spotter melted back into the jungle. That night, for the first time in weeks, the perimeter at Hill 55 was silent. There were no screams. The demon was dead. It was a grim victory. Hathcock had saved future Marines from torture. But the act of killing, even killing a monster, leaves a mark on the soul that never washes off. Carlos Hathcock's war didn't end with a rifle in his hand. It ended in fire. In 1969, he was riding on top of an Amtrak, a massive amphibious assault vehicle, when it struck a 500-pound anti-tank mine. The explosion was massive. The 30-ton vehicle was flipped into the air. Gasoline sprayed everywhere and ignited. Hathcock was thrown clear, but he was knocked unconscious. When he woke up, he saw the Amtrak was a ball of fire. 7 Marines were trapped inside, burning alive. Hathcock didn't run away. He ran toward the fire. He had severe burns on his face, his arms, and his legs. His skin was hanging off in sheets. But he didn't stop. He jumped onto the burning vehicle. He grabbed a Marine and pulled him out. Then he went back for another. And another. He pulled 7 men out of that inferno. He only stopped when his own body gave out and he collapsed from the pain. He received the Silver Star for that day. But his career as a sniper was over. His nerves were damaged. His hands shook too much to hold a rifle steady. The man who had lived by stillness was now defined by pain. The snipers of Vietnam came home to a country that didn't understand them. They weren't greeted as heroes. They were called murderers. How do you explain to a civilian what it takes to lie in the mud for 3 days? How do you explain the math of killing? How do you explain that you killed to save lives? Many of them struggled. They hid their medals. They buried their memories. Chuck Mawhinney went back to Oregon and worked for the Forest Service for 20 years. He didn't tell a soul about his 103 confirmed kills. Not his wife, not his friends. It wasn't until a book mentioned his name decades later that his secret came out. When his friends asked him why he never talked about it, he just said, "I did what I had to do, and then I came home." But their legacy lived on. Before Vietnam, the U.S. military treated sniping as a hobby. After Vietnam, they realized it was a science. Carlos Hathcock helped establish the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School at Quantico. He taught the next generation. He taught them that the most important weapon isn't the rifle, it's the mind. His motto became the creed of the community. 1 shot, 1 kill. Today, every Marine sniper knows the name White Feather. They know about the feather in the hat. They know about the scope shot. They know about the crawl. The snipers of Vietnam were a special breed. They walked alone in the valley of the shadow of death. They feared no evil because they were the scariest thing in the valley. As we look back at their stories, we don't just see the kill counts. We see the cost. We see the young men who aged 20 years in a single tour. We see the men who can still smell the jungle rot and the burning cordite when they close their eyes at night. They were the invisible warriors, the ghosts of the jungle, and they never truly left. Thank you for watching this series on Beneath the Metal. The story of the Vietnam snipers is one of patience, skill, and terrifying intimacy with death. If you honor their service, please subscribe and share this video. Semper Fi.